Hello, I'm Toby. I called this ruthless automation. I'm not sure that it's that ruthless, really, but let's see how it goes. Maybe it is. OK, so I work at Be Social, a startup here in London, trying to build a bank from scratch, challenger bank. A little bit intimidating being back in Old Street with Monzo just around the corner, because we are nowhere near as big as Monzo yet, but hope to be one day. The idea behind Be Social is that social finances can be very awkward and high friction. And so the founder's vision is to try and remove all of the friction from kind of social banking. So think when you're going on holidays with friends or family or in flat shares with people, trying to kind of manage your finances and move money around each other and keep track of everything. Sometimes that can cause friction and awkwardness. And so he wants to kind of build a bank that actually models those real life situations that people have, rather than treating people as atomized individuals, instead kind of helping them with their finances within groups of friends. So what that means is that we're building a bank from scratch in one of the hardest countries in the world to build a bank from a regulatory perspective, and a social network, which is also not necessarily a trivial undertaking. We're obviously setting ourselves a difficult challenge, and it turns out it is quite difficult to do both of those things. OK, so I started to Be Social right at the beginning. When I arrived, I was actually there with ThoughtWorks, consulting with the delivery team. And when we arrived, there was no internet connection, there was nothing. It was brand new. They didn't have any technology capability, and we had to try and build everything from scratch. So that was a really fun place to be, because it was a completely blank slate, but also when it's a completely blank slate, it's quite hard to turn that white canvas into something real, something that actually represents what it's meant to. So we had lots of kind of early discussions about how we wanted to approach that. And so first I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of decisions we made early on from an architectural perspective and from an infrastructure perspective, and kind of why we were led in that direction. So the challenge we faced was that we are a startup, but we're also trying to be a bank. And they have very different kind of requirements. And then when you mash the two together, it's quite hard to actually come up with a good strategy and good approach. So over in startup land, we want to optimize for validated learning. We've got all of these assumptions about how people interact with each other and how our product could potentially help them. And so we want to be able to kind of validate those assumptions, learn as fast as we can, and see whether our proposition makes sense, and maybe switch and change and pivot. And we want to be able to do that by kind of experimenting, trying things that could completely fail. They might lose us customers. They might be damaging to the customer even, so that we can kind of work out the boundaries of that through kind of small, focused experiments. We wanted to be able to go fast and break things. Completely stolen from Facebook, but it's kind of true. We wanted to kind of put stuff out, see what worked, and then if things failed, they failed. That's OK. We'll fix them. And we kind of wanted to build for today, and then enhance and evolve if things were successful, but completely throw things away if they failed. On the bank side, we need to optimize for stability, control, which kind of is contradictory to some of the things on the left. We wanted to closely manage change, make sure that things we were pushing out were high quality. They weren't going to kind of cause any kind of major issues for our customers. We needed to be available, scalable, reliable, and we kind of needed to build for the long term. So we were kind of faced with this dichotomy when we were trying to come up with a good approach to architecture. Now, obviously, we are in fact still going through the application process to become a bank. So we weren't a bank on day one. So some of the things on the right weren't immediately important, but we had to kind of keep them in mind so that as we kind of evolved on that path, we could achieve those without having to throw too much away and start again from scratch. So what did we do? Well, the advice typically when you're kind of starting out, when you don't know much about your domain, when you're kind of still learning in the early days, is to go monolith first. This comes from Martin Fowler. So architecturally, just build one big box, chuck everything in it, keep it simple, and then when you learn a little bit more about that, start to break things out and kind of scale your system up based on kind of things that you've actually learned. Yeah, so we could have gone monolith first. And that probably would have been better from a startup perspective. We could go fast, we could chuck things in, didn't need to deal with any of the added complexity of something like a big, elaborate distributed system. But we actually felt like maybe we could cope with a little bit more early on based on the experience of the people in the team. They'd worked in bigger architectures than this, and they felt that they wanted to lay some of the groundwork for the things on the previous slide in the right, rather than just focusing on the things on the left. So we didn't go for a monolith. Instead, we looked at going microservice first, against advice from Martin Fowler himself. And so we actually chose a relatively meaty architecture, I guess. But what we liked about this was that actually, in some respects, it allowed us to try things, throw them out, see whether they worked, and throw them away without necessarily impacting the wider system as a whole. So whilst we were taking on a lot more complexity, we were also kind of buying some other flexibilities in the architecture. So we were okay with that. Okay, so we went down this path. What about infrastructurally? So the major problem with a big microservice architecture is that what you're really doing is pushing all of the complexity about managing your system into the gaps between the services. And so you kind of make what were previously application problems infrastructural problems instead. So we then had to kind of think through how we were going to manage that and how we were going to be able to deal with all the added complexity of microservices and the additional kind of infrastructural complexity that that brought. So again, in the startup world, it should be nice and cheap. We didn't have a great deal of money when we first started. We should be able to get up and running very quickly. We want to be able to get things out there, go fast. And it should be kind of easily accessible for anyone. If people wanted to put something in prod, test it with users, then they should be able to just do that without really involving different teams or having all sorts of different constraints on them. On the bank side, we felt we needed to be provider agnostic. Some of the early conversations we were having with the regulator were saying that they were kind of nervous about people using cloud for everything. And so they wanted people to kind of take that into account, make sure that they weren't too coupled to any one cloud, and could kind of shift and change as the market did. We needed to be very resilient and very secure and access controlled. So again, a bit of a dichotomy. We looked into using something like serverless. This was a couple of years ago now. And so at the time, this was starting to boom, starting to become a big thing. But what we found was that it was still very kind of cloud provider specific at that point. That I think has changed now. It's starting to become more possible to move things around if you ever need to, or to kind of not be too coupled to one particular kind of serverless provider. But at the time, we were quite nervous about that. And I think a lot of the kind of controls that were needed or security concepts that were needed weren't really present at that point in time. So we did think about it, but in the end, didn't go with serverless. Instead, we looked at containerization and kind of using Docker, and which is kind of becoming a very well-defined standard for this kind of stuff, so that it can move between clouds quite easily, relatively easily. We could also then leverage a bunch of existing kind of tools and services and deploy everything in quite a consistent way. So in the end, we decided that containerization is the way to go. However, after this kind of decision-making process, we got to the point where we were going for a pretty heavy architecture with a pretty operationally involved infrastructure approach. And so as a team, we were trying to work out how we could do that and still maintain all of the startup qualities. So being able to go fast, do things, get things out there, and experiment, and also the bank qualities, do so reliably, highly available, highly scalable, all that kind of stuff. So what we decided was we would still go down this somewhat crazy path, but instead we would automate everything we possibly could. So we would ruthlessly automate. The idea being that if we automated away all of the problems that we faced, we'd be able to keep a sustainable pace and not be slowed down by the architectural choices we'd made, and kind of, as we evolve the architecture and the platform, build on everything that we'd done before. So we started out at the kind of infrastructural level. And we wanted to use infrastructure as code because that allows us to take all of the different pieces of the infrastructure that we needed and define them in code, potentially even in a testable way, so that we could repeatably deploy all of the different parts of the system at whatever frequency we needed without too much trouble. And we ended up deciding to use Terraform for this, which is a tool that allows this kind of automation, this kind of encoding your infrastructure, rather than the tools that were available with the cloud we were using directly, because it's kind of, again, nice and general, allows us to work across lots of different cloud providers. And we started building small modules for each of the different bits of the system that we needed. We built things in quite a modular way. because we wanted to be able to replace things as we went along and make things kind of evolvable. And so we ended up with quite a few of these modules. And so what this allowed was for us to go from nothing, blank slate, to kind of fully working environment for us to deploy all of our bits and pieces into, pretty fast, pretty reliably, and with lots of kind of good practices and security and that kind of thing built in as standard as part of that code as part of that deployment. But what wasn't so good at this point is actually a lot of these things depend on each other, and so we needed to coordinate which bits got deployed when in order to make sure that everything came up working as expected, which was kind of a headache. So this tool kind of helped us get so far in our automation, but we needed something more to be able to do that kind of when we were trying to deal with lots of moving pieces at once. So we looked to build automation. And so there's lots of tooling available out there that lets you kind of define these kind of sequences of how things get deployed out into the cloud, up and running, and kind of make sure that that's repeatable but at a kind of higher granularity, say. So everyone in the team had experience with Ruby, and Ruby has some tooling around this that allows you to kind of define these dependencies and make sure that everything is kind of you can get up and running with it in one command, with one script. So again, there were some gaps. We needed some tooling, and so we started building small, independent modules, libraries that allowed us to wrap all of this stuff up into quite chunky, big bits of environment and deployment. So we wrote a few of those so that we could run one command and effectively have a full working copy of our platform up and running in a production-like environment or even production itself. Okay, well that was all good, but at that point we're still sitting on our local laptops, running commands arbitrarily, different people in the team. And so we wanted to kind of make this a little bit more of a formalized process, something that we could kind of rely on just happening. Whenever a change was made, it would happen the same way every time, repeatably, and well-tested with confidence. So we looked to our trusty continuous integration tools or continuous deployment tools. And again, rather than manually configuring these things, point and click in a browser, we decided that pipelines as code was the way to go. So another layer of automation on top of what we already had so far. We could now define pipelines that would take us from a new service that needs to go into production, deploy all of the supporting infrastructure, push it out into production after heavy testing and vetting through different environments, so that then we had kind of things in prod that we could have confidence in. Okay, now actually we took all of this stuff and wrapped it up into an open source organization because a few of us in the team had written this numerous times before and were tired of writing it again and again on different teams. So all of this stuff is kind of available on GitHub at that address, with a few examples of how you can kind of pull it all together end to end and kind of get something up and running in a production-like quality, currently only in AWS, but in future we plan to make this something possible across different clouds as well. Okay, a quick note on the testing of that stuff. We also wanted to make sure that we could make changes to this infrastructure code in a way that wouldn't impact what we already had. These were scripts that could potentially destroy our production environments if we did something wrong. So we obviously wanted to make sure that we had confidence that any change we were making at the infrastructure level wasn't going to damage anything out there in production. So we built some kind of testing harnesses that could provision all of the kind of prerequisite bits and pieces for an environment, provision the thing that we wanted to test, run a bunch of tests, maybe reprovisioning as it went, destroying the thing that we're testing, and then destroying everything else. Again, completely automated way of making a change to our entire platform and seeing whether it has the intended effect in a nice, repeatable manner. Okay, at this point, we were able to deploy all of the infrastructure that we needed to run all of the services that backed our product, but we were still having conversations about whether it was worth introducing a new service for whatever purpose, because it was taking too long, I don't know, hours and hours for us to get something up and running and out there in production. So went back to our trusty automation and tried to find a way of minimizing that as well. So we used a tool called Yeoman, which allows you to kind of template out arbitrary things. And we got to a point where we could, with one command, create a brand new service. We wanted to put something new in production, create something brand new, deploy all of the different environments that were needed for that, push into GitHub, and then create a pipeline in our CI tool, and that pipeline would build it, test it through various levels of testing, push it into development, and push it into prod. So at this point, we could go from, I need a new service, to I have one up and running in production, ready to go, in about 5 to 10 minutes. And that was largely because of the investments we'd made at all of the levels below in kind of very kind of strictly automating as much as possible. Okay. So now we have something up and running in production, a real service. Hopefully it does something useful. But we wanted also to get to the point where we could make sure that thing continued to work. So all of the testing we were doing on the kind of modules and parts of the infrastructure ahead of time, we needed to make sure that it actually did what it said on the tin once it made it out. But again, we wanted this to be something that was repeatable. Kind of as soon as we deployed something new, it just fit into that monitoring infrastructure and got picked up automatically without us needing to do any heavy manual work. So we kind of pieced together a bunch of different open source tooling to get to the point where whenever we ran that microservice generator, we could have a new service in prod and it would start popping up on all of our dashboards, all of our monitoring, reporting when it was unhealthy, and actually phoning us up in the middle of the night if it wasn't doing what it was supposed to. So at this point, not only can we get a service deployed into production in 5 minutes, but we also then get notified at minute 10 that it was a terrible idea and it's completely broken and we should get rid of it. Okay. The next step beyond that was that we wanted to make the operations of all of these different pieces integrated into our ways of working as a team. So we looked to ChatOps, which is a way of kind of taking all of the operational work that you need to do to keep a system up and running and building tooling to allow that to happen in chat, just as chats happen between people in your team. So what we wanted to get to was a stage where the system, the platform, was reporting its status, any problems, anything that was going on out there, to the team in our case, Slack, so that they could react and potentially fix those problems as fast as possible, hopefully before a customer's noticed. So this has been quite useful for us in that now we can do things. We've been investing a little in bots that allow us to kind of ask different questions of our infrastructure, of our platform. So this is Pennybags. Pennybags we can ask Pennybags when everything was last deployed, and it'll go off and investigate and work out that actually a few of our services haven't made it. There's quite a big lag between our dev environment and our prod environment. We should probably work on getting those things tested, ready to go, pushed out into production. And we want to get this bot a little bit more advanced. Right now, it doesn't actually help us solve that problem, but it at least alerts us to it, helps us find out that we've got some work to do to get all of our environments back in sync. We also use this for all of our monitoring and alerting. So whenever anything is going wrong, anything is having infrastructural problems or whatever else, it notifies straight back into Slack, and anyone in the team can pick it up. So it kind of democratizes that side of the operations to the whole team, and people are alerted when things are going on. We've actually started extending this further into kind of workflows and operations and supporting our customers as well. So now the platform will notify when things are going on at a business level as well. And in this case, someone's just applied for an account with us. Someone's picked it up, and they're working on it, and they're replying to that, giving some information to the rest of the team about the status of that thing, so that anyone can pick up where they left off or join in if they need to help move that application along, run some extra checks, whatever else. Okay, so, sorry, that was backwards. That's where we've got to today. We're at the point where pretty much every part of our operations is supported by automation in some respect, from the tiniest piece of infrastructure that we deploy right up to business level processes that everyone in the organization is involved in. Where do we go from here? How do we continue to be ruthless with our automation? Well, one area that's still a big gap for us is making sure that all the different credentials that we hold are manageable. we've got systems in place right now that allow us to do so, to kind of keep track of those things securely. So we're using a tool called Git-Crypt, which helps with that. And that's worked pretty well, but we're now starting to kind of outgrow that tool, and so we need to look at something a bit more sophisticated to make sure that all the database credentials and certificates and that kind of thing are safely stored and easy to manage. We're now at the stage where there's about 100 repositories across the organization, 15 different people modifying those every day. So anytime anyone needs to be added to something different or leaves the company or whatever else, it's a nightmare for us to go back and rotate everything, make sure that all the credentials have been switched out so that they're not able to access things anymore. So what we're looking at for that is another way of managing this, and there are services available that help with kind of storing these credentials and making sure that you can manage them. So we're looking at a tool called HashiCorp Vault, which fits in quite nicely with the rest of our platform and kind of solves this problem, allows us to kind of deal with that kind of change as well. I think more interestingly, though, is as a wannabe bank, we have lots of requirements on us to make sure that everything we're doing is very controlled and only the right people can do the right things. And so what we don't want to get into is a situation where everything has to go up a hierarchy to get approval way up high, and that takes days, and that means we can't get our new experimental thing out into prod to test with our users. So we still need to be able to make sure that there's checks and balances, but not checks and balances that overall interrupt our flow as a product team. So what we're looking at now is taking this kind of ChatOps model and extending it out a little bit further. So we want things like release consensus. We want to be able to, in Slack, message when something's ready to go out to production and get the entire, everyone who contributed to that change or to that set of changes to kind of go and test out in some kind of pre-production environment, make sure everything's good, sign it off, and potentially get anyone else who needs to approve that to sign that off as well, so that we can keep all of those approvals in place without necessarily impeding the flow. Another thing we'd quite like to do is apply the same kind of thing to production access credentials. If we're debugging things, we'd quite like it that I can go into Slack. We'd quite like to be able to go into Slack, ask some bot for some access to some production credentials. Maybe that needs to be approved by someone else. And then that person starts being monitored whilst they're working on that. Those are time limited. They get sent back to the person in Slack. They use them for a while, and then they expire. All of those kinds of processes can be encoded inside of our automation so that people can still go fast, but in a way that's controlled and meets the requirements of the regulator. As I mentioned, we're kind of looking at more workflow type stuff, so different kind of roles within the organization that need to look after our customers or do things on behalf of them. We want to make those processes more visible and actually make them kind of achievable through our ChatOps system. So what we would like to get to is some situation where we have supportive systems. So our customer support, for instance, can chat that they need to do a thing, the system picks that up, goes and does it, reports the results back so that they can have a kind of very seamless flow in terms of getting the information they need to support the customer. So we're kind of seeing this as like a command line for our business. We'll see how it goes, it's still early days, but our dream is that we can use the same kind of DevOps automation approaches that we use for technology as a way of making the business flow as well. Okay, that's everything from me.